G'day, Professor Joseph Drew again. There'll be lots of videos like this for Federation councils. As you know, your councils engaged me to ascertain the financial sustainability situation of council, to understand the advantages and disadvantages of the amalgamation and how that's impacted on our sustainability, and to plot a way forward. Now, part of all that also is connecting with the community and making sure you guys know how local government finances work. So in this video, I'll talk about a crucial part of any rural local government's revenue stream, and that's the financial assistance grants. Typically about a third of your income comes from these grants, and there's significant controversy about how they're allocated. And people like me have said quite openly they're chaotic and indefensible the way the money's been handed out. It's not achieving the purposes of the legislation at all. Now, this has important implications for the people in Federation Shire, so hang on, watch the video all the way through, and hopefully you'll have a better understanding of matters. So, financial assistance grants. Unfortunately, they get abbreviated to FAGs. So if you hear councillors or council staff talk about FAGs, they're talking about this. What is it? It's actually money from the Commonwealth government, from the federal government. And it's money that's given to achieve a certain purpose. And the purpose is horizontal fiscal equalisation, which I'll go into in other slides. Now, the money's allocated by a state grants body, but we must never lose sight that it's actually the federal government's money. It has its own piece of legislation, the Financial Assistance Grants Act 1995. It's a Commonwealth piece of Commonwealth legislation, and it is the law. It's very interesting given what you're about to hear on this matter. And why does it matter? This is a pie chart of your revenue for Federation Shire. You can see your rates and your annual charges together only come up to 32% of your revenue. It's less than a third of your money, and that includes annual charges. You use the charges and fees, about 17%. And then you have two grant pies. One is capital grants. They've been very large since the amalgamation. That's money to build things, and you can only spend the money on building the thing you got the money for. It is unlawful to spend that money on anything else. And the other part is what this video is mainly about, which is these operating grants. Usually they're untied. You can spend that money on operating expenditure, things like staff wages, materials, contracts, things like that. And a key component of that are these FAG grants that we're speaking of. So how is the money allocated? It should be allocated strictly in accordance with the national principles and the piece of federal legislation that outlines precisely what is required. Things such as transparency and accountability, which some states, including New South Wales, don't seem to think applies to them. But the key thing of this legislation, the key objective of this legislation, is what economists call horizontal fiscal equalisation. Great big phrase for the following definition, which is on the screen, which are cut straight out of the legislation itself. It simply ensures that each local government in a state is able to function by reasonable effort at a standard not lower than the average standard of other local governing bodies in the state. Okay, to put it in even simpler terms, if each local government does the right thing, charges a reasonable amount of rates, charges reasonable fees, and they're not terribly inefficient, they should be able to provide a set of basic standard services, such as bitumen roads and the like, that any other council anywhere else in the country ought to be able to provide. So the money should be sufficient to allow you to have basic standards of services. Now, you only need to drive through rural local governments in New South Wales, or any state for that matter, and to find out that legislation is not being achieved. This objective of legislation is not being achieved at all. And that's really unfortunate. And it's particularly unfortunate for rural communities, particularly very large area rural communities such as the Federation Shire, which is one of the bigger councils in the state. as I've said, this money is Commonwealth money, but it's allocated by state local government grants commission, in our case the New South Wales Local Government Grants Commission, and it's done so in that manner because there is an argument that under the Constitution a federal government cannot pass money direct to local governments because local governments aren't mentioned in the Constitution. Remember, Australia is a collection of colonies who came together, who held on to most of the lawful powers and only gave some powers to the federal government. Now, as it turns out, the federal government does give local councils money all the time directly, but at the time that this was all started up, people thought it couldn't be done. So we get our money allocated to us by the New South Wales Local Government Grants Commission. The problem is each state grants commissions beating to their own very special drum. They all don't seem to think that the parts of the legislation about accountability and transparency are really meant to be observed. And they don't quite grasp a handle on the objectives and the proper way of allocating according to this horizontal fiscal equalisation principle. So I suspect, and I think if you drive around rural New South Wales too, you'll see that the standard of services is much lower than the standard of roads and services that we have in cities. So I suspect strongly that we've been shorted and that the HFE, horizontal fiscal equalisation principles of the federal law, have not been observed. But it gets even more complicated. For amalgamated councils, for a period of 4 years following the amalgamation, the law guarantees that your payment will not be less than what it would have been had we calculated it separately for each of the former councils and added the numbers together. Now, in the case of an area like Federation Shire, where one of the former local government areas, Corowa, had a much higher socioeconomic status than the other, and also had much higher numbers of people, we could expect that following amalgamation, your grants probably would go down quite significantly, hundreds of thousands of dollars, had this protection not been in place. One of the things I've got to do is make sure that this protection, and it is the law, it's a part of the proclamation under the Financial Assistance Grant Act 1995, that this protection was actually put in place for those 4 years. But of course those 4 years have expired now, and grants are going down compared to the rate of relative to other councils in the area. And this is one of the costs of amalgamations that people simply ignored. I was trying to bring people's attention to it back in 2015. Unfortunately, people neglected this, and this is part of the puzzle that explains how we got to where we are. When I do the public forum, I will provide more detail on precisely how I think this played out for us, and I will also suggest to your council some means by which we might get matters remedied if necessary. So, as you probably appreciate just from this little example, local government finance is super complicated, and that's why I'm here. And your council's done the right thing by engaging someone with the expertise. This is all I've done for the last 15 years, who knows the ins and outs of legislation and has the mathematical tools. That's what my main job is, an econometrician. I do the super duper maths that no one else wants to do. I've got the mathematical tools to find out if we have received our fair due or not, if things have been done properly or not. And I will be outlining these things to you and making lots more videos to talk about all the different aspects of expenditure and revenue as I go along the journey. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.